I was standing by the grill, watching the flames dance under a rack of ribs, when my world imploded. The evening had been perfect, one of those Pacific Northwest summer nights where the air smells like cedar and possibility. Our backyard was filled with the usual suspects: neighbors, friends, and family members who'd shown up for our annual barbecue. The kind of gathering that makes suburbanites feel sophisticated and connected. Nessa was in her element, floating between groups with that effortless charm that had first attracted me 15 years ago. She wore a flowing sundress that caught the golden hour light just right, her auburn hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than her 35 years. As a social media manager, she understood presentation better than most, and tonight she was performing flawlessly. I'd been content to play the role of the quiet husband, the custom furniture maker who preferred sawdust to small talk. My workshop was my sanctuary, and these social events were Nessa's domain. I was just the guy who grilled the meat and refilled drinks. That's when Elara decided to torch everything. Elara had been Nessa's best friend since college, a real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and a talent for knowing everyone's business. She had this way of inserting herself into conversations with the confidence of someone who believed her opinions mattered more than they actually did. Tonight, she'd been hitting the wine harder than usual, her voice getting progressively louder as the evening wore on. I was flipping the ribs when I heard her voice cut through the ambient chatter like a chainsaw through pine. "Rhett," she called out, raising her wine glass in my direction. "When are you finally leaving Nessa?" The backyard went quiet. Not just quiet. It went silent in that way that makes your ears ring. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone's drink glass clinked against a table. Even the neighbor's dog seemed to pause its barking. I looked up from the grill, tongs still in my hand, and met Elara's glassy-eyed stare. She was swaying slightly, that particular kind of drunk where inhibitions evaporate but motor functions mostly remain intact. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice steady despite the sudden hammering in my chest. Elara giggled, and took another sip of wine. "Oh, come on, don't play dumb. Everyone knows you two are practically roommates at this point." She gestured vaguely in Nessa's direction. "Wait." Her eyes widened with theatrical surprise. "He doesn't know about your ex, does he?" The silence deepened. I could feel every pair of eyes in the backyard focused on this moment, waiting to see how the drama would unfold. Nessa's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. I set down the tongs and reached for my phone. My hands were remarkably steady as I opened the camera app and hit record. The red dot appeared on the screen, capturing everything. "Nobody leaves," I said, my voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. I walked to the gate and turned the lock with a deliberate click. "This is just getting interesting." Elara blinked at me, confusion replacing her earlier smugness. "What are you doing?" "Getting the truth," I replied, holding up my phone so everyone could see I was recording. "Elara, can you repeat what you just said? Slowly this time, for the record." The wine had loosened her tongue beyond any hope of discretion. Instead of backing down, she leaned into the moment with the enthusiasm of someone who thrived on drama. I said, "When are you leaving Nessa? Because honestly, everyone's been wondering. And clearly you don't know about Mason, her ex who isn't really an ex, if you know what I mean." She laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the evening air. "They've been meeting up for months. Hotels, his place when his wife's out of town, very romantic." Nessa finally found her voice. "Elara, stop. You're drunk. You don't know what you're talking about." But Elara was on a roll now, energized by the attention and the wine. "Oh, please, Ness. I've been covering for you since March. Remember the spa weekend that wasn't actually a spa weekend? Or the work conference in Portland that Mason just happened to attend?" I kept the camera rolling, watching through the screen as my wife's best friend systematically destroyed her life. Part of me felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. Horrifying, but impossible to look away from. "What about dates?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "Can you be more specific?" Elara checked her phone, scrolling through what looked like text messages. "Let's see. There was April 15th at the Marriott downtown. May 3rd at his condo. Oh, and just last week they met at that little boutique hotel in Bellingham. Very cute place, apparently." Nessa was shaking now, whether from rage or panic. I couldn't tell. "Rhett, she's lying. She's drunk, and she's lying." I stopped recording and immediately opened our neighborhood group chat, the one that included everyone currently standing in my backyard. With a few taps, I uploaded the video and added a simple caption. "For the record, tonight's barbecue entertainment." The notification sound started immediately as phones began buzzing around the yard. People pulled out their devices, watching the video I just recorded while the subjects of that video stood frozen in front of them. "There," I said, pocketing my phone. Now everyone has the same information. The next few minutes were chaos. Nessa lunged toward me, trying to grab my phone, but I stepped aside easily. Elara's partner, Jules, a quiet accountant who'd always seemed too good for her, stared at his girlfriend with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Is this true?" Jules asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elara's bravado finally cracked. I was just the wine." "Is it true?" he repeated, louder this time. She couldn't meet his eyes. That was answer enough. Nessa's parents, who'd been visiting from California and had been enjoying what they thought was a pleasant family gathering, looked like they'd been slapped. Her father, a retired bank manager with old-fashioned values about marriage and fidelity, shook his head slowly. "Vanessa," her mother said, using the formal name that Nessa had abandoned in college. "What is this woman talking about? It's not... She's exaggerating. She doesn't understand the situation." "What situation?" I asked. "The situation where you're having an affair with Mason Kittredge?" The name hung in the air like smoke. Mason Kittredge, hedge fund manager, neighborhood golden boy, married to a sweet woman named Claire who organized charity drives and baked cookies for school fundraisers. Mason, who'd been Nessa's boyfriend in college before they'd supposedly gone their separate ways. Mason, who lived 6 blocks away in a house twice the size of ours. "He's not just an ex, is he?" I continued, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "He's current." Nessa's silence was confirmation enough. I looked around the backyard at our guests, neighbors, friends, family members, all of them witnessing the implosion of my marriage in real time. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated. A few were still staring at their phones, probably rewatching the video or sharing it with people who hadn't been here to see it live. "Well," I said, turning back to the grill where the ribs were starting to char. "Dinner's almost ready. Anyone still hungry?" The absurdity of the question broke whatever spell had held everyone frozen. People began moving toward the gate, murmuring excuses about early mornings and prior commitments. Jules grabbed Elara's arm and steered her toward the exit without a word. Nessa's parents followed, her mother shooting disappointed looks over her shoulder. Within 10 minutes, the backyard was empty except for Nessa and me. She stood by the patio table, arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than I'd seen her in years. "Rhett," she started, but I held up a hand. "Not tonight," I said, turning off the grill. "Tonight I'm going to finish cleaning up. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Without another word, she walked into the house, leaving me alone with the cooling evening air and the wreckage of our life together. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the hum of air conditioners. Somewhere in the neighborhood, people were probably already talking about what they'd witnessed. The video would spread beyond our immediate circle. These things always did. My phone buzzed with notifications, text messages, missed calls, social media alerts. The digital aftermath was just beginning, but I wasn't ready to deal with any of that yet. Instead, I methodically cleaned the grill, packed away the leftover food, and stacked the abandoned plates and glasses. The familiar routine gave me something to focus on while my mind processed what had just happened. My wife was having an affair. Her best friend had exposed it at our barbecue. I'd recorded the confession and shared it with our entire social circle. In the span of 20 minutes, my marriage had become neighborhood entertainment. The smart thing would probably be to take down the video, try to contain the damage, maybe attempt some kind of reconciliation. That's what a reasonable person would do. But as I turned off the patio lights and headed inside, I realized I wasn't feeling particularly reasonable. I was feeling something else entirely, something cold and calculating that I'd never experienced before. Nessa was already upstairs, probably crying or calling someone or trying to figure out how to spin this disaster. I could hear her voice through the ceiling, muffled but urgent. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and started thinking about what Elara had said. Specific dates, specific locations, hotel receipts, conference trips, spa weekends. If she was telling the truth, and her level of detail suggested she was, then this affair had been going on for months, maybe longer, which meant there would be evidence. Electronic trails, financial records, digital breadcrumbs that could paint a very clear picture of exactly what my wife had been doing behind my back. I cracked my knuckles and opened a new browser window. Time to do some digging. I didn't sleep that night. While Nessa tossed and turned upstairs, I could hear the bed creaking through the ceiling. I conducted what I came to think of as digital archaeology. 15 years of marriage had created an intricate web of shared accounts, devices, and digital spaces. Most couples accumulate this kind of technological intimacy without thinking about it. Tonight, it was going to work in my favor. I started with the obvious places. Our shared cloud storage account contained years of photos, documents, and automatically backed up files. Nessa had always been careless about digital security, using the same password for multiple accounts and never bothering to check what was syncing where. The first thing I found was a folder labeled Work Conferences that contained photos from the Portland trip Elara had mentioned. There was Nessa in a hotel bathroom mirror, wearing lingerie I didn't recognize. The timestamp showed it was taken during her supposed work conference. The location data embedded in the photo confirmed she was at the Marriott downtown, not at the convention center where her conference was being held. But the real treasure was in her automatically synced text messages. Nessa's phone backed up everything to our shared account, and she'd never bothered to change the settings. Months of conversations with Mason scrolled past my screen like a roadmap of betrayal. March 15th. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Room 412, right? March 22nd. That was amazing. When can we do it again? April 8th. Rhett's working late again. Want to come over? April 15th. Booked the usual place. See you at 6. The messages went on and on. A detailed chronicle of their affair. Hotel confirmations, meeting times, some intimate details that made my stomach turn. But what struck me most was the casual nature of it all. They weren't star-crossed lovers torn apart by circumstances. They were two selfish people who'd decided their pleasure was more important than their commitments. I screenshot everything, organizing the evidence by date and location. Then I cross-referenced the hotel bookings with our credit card statements. Nessa had been using our joint account to pay for some of these encounters, which meant I'd been unknowingly funding my own humiliation. The Portland conference was particularly galling. She'd charged the hotel, meals, and even a bottle of champagne to our account. The conference registration showed she'd only attended 1 day of sessions out of 3. The rest of the time, according to her messages with Mason, they'd been playing house in a suite overlooking the river. By 3 in the morning, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier of their affair. Dates, locations, financial records, photos, and hundreds of text messages. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled up the contact information for the Marriott downtown and several other hotels mentioned in the messages. A few phone calls to night managers, claiming to be following up on corporate billing discrepancies, confirmed that Nessa and Mason had been regular guests, always booking rooms under her name, always paying with our joint account. The financial trail was even more damaging than the messages. Over 6 months, Nessa had spent nearly $8,000 on hotels, restaurants, and shopping trips that I now realized had been part of her affair. She'd been systematically draining our joint account to fund her relationship with Mason. As the sun started to rise, I made my first strategic move. I logged into our bank's website and changed the access codes for our joint accounts, reducing Nessa's daily spending limit to $50. It wasn't enough to cut her off completely, that might have legal ramifications, but it would certainly cramp her style. Next, I called our home security company and requested new access codes for the house. As the primary account holder and homeowner, I had the authority to make that change immediately. By 7 a.m., Nessa's key code would no longer work. Then I did something that felt particularly satisfying. I scheduled a meeting with Jules, Elara's partner. He'd looked genuinely shocked at the barbecue, which suggested he'd been as much in the dark as I was. If Elara had been helping Nessa cover up the affair, Jules deserved to know exactly how extensive that help had been. I sent him a carefully worded email, attaching selected screenshots and suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss what we both learned last night. I kept the tone sympathetic but businesslike, one betrayed partner reaching out to another. By the time I heard Nessa stirring upstairs, I had already showered, dressed, and prepared a folder of printed evidence. I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and toast when she came downstairs, looking like she hadn't slept any better than I had. "Rhett," she started, but I held up a hand. "Before you say anything," I said, sliding the folder across the table, "you should probably look at this." She opened the folder and her face went white. The first page was a timeline I'd created, listing every hotel visit, every charge to our joint account, every lie she'd told about work trips and girls' weekends. The pages that followed contained screenshots of her most damaging text messages with Mason. "How did you?" she whispered. "Shared cloud storage," I said calmly. "Your phone backs up everything automatically, has for years. I'm surprised you forgot about that." She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking slightly. You can't use this. It's private." "Private?" I almost laughed. "Nessa, you used our joint bank account to pay for hotel rooms. You charged your affair to our credit cards. There's nothing private about spending my money to cheat on me." She closed the folder and looked up at me with what I thought might be desperation. "Look, I know this looks bad, but it's not what you think. Mason and we have history. We were trying to figure things out." "Figure things out?" I repeated. For 6 months? In hotel rooms that I paid for? It's complicated. Actually, it's pretty simple. You're having an affair. You've been lying to me about it, and you've been using our money to fund it. I took a sip of coffee. The only complicated part is figuring out what happens next. Nessa's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted from desperation to something harder. Elara wants to meet, she said. She feels terrible about last night. She was drunk, and she exaggerated everything. Exaggerated? I gestured to the folder. Which part was exaggerated? The hotel receipts? The text messages? The photos? She's willing to set the record straight. Tell everyone she was lying. I studied my wife's face, noting the calculation behind her eyes. She was already working on damage control, trying to figure out how to spin this situation back in her favor. That's interesting, I said, because I've already shared some of this information with Jules. We're meeting for coffee this morning to compare notes about what our partners have been up to. The color drained from her face again. You can't do that. That's harassment. It's communication between two people who've been lied to by the people they trust most. I stood up and put my coffee mug in the sink. I'll be back this afternoon. We can talk more then. Where are you going? To have that coffee with Jules. Then I thought I'd stop by your parents' hotel and show them some of these interesting financial records. They're always so curious about how we manage our money. Nessa shot to her feet. You can't tell my parents. Why not? They're family. They should know what's going on. Rhett, please, let's talk about this. We can work it out. I paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at her. Work what out exactly? The affair? The lies? The fact that you've been stealing from our joint account to pay for hotel rooms? I wasn't stealing. It's my money too. Money you earned by lying to me about where you were going and what you were doing. I shook my head. No, Nessa. We're way past the point where talking fixes anything. I left her standing in the kitchen and headed for my truck. My phone was already buzzing with messages, probably responses to the barbecue video that was still circulating through our social circle. I'd deal with those later. Right now, I had a coffee date with Jules, and I was looking forward to comparing notes about the two women who'd been playing us for fools. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a clear sense of purpose. Nessa and Elara thought they could manipulate the narrative, convince people that last night was just drunken exaggeration. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Jules looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. When I walked into the coffee shop, I found him hunched over a corner table, staring into a cup that had probably gone cold an hour ago. His usually neat appearance was disheveled. Wrinkled shirt, unshaved face, the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent the night questioning everything they thought they knew about their life. Thanks for meeting me, I said, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up with the expression of a man who'd been gut-punched. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out last night was just a nightmare. I felt the same way until about 4 this morning, I replied, signaling the barista for coffee. That's when I stopped hoping it wasn't real and started documenting exactly how real it was. I pulled out a tablet and opened the folder of evidence I'd compiled. Jules leaned forward as I showed him the timeline, the hotel receipts, the text messages between Nessa and Mason. Jesus, he whispered, scrolling through the screenshots. How long has this been going on? Based on what I found, at least 6 months. Probably longer. I pointed to one of the earlier messages. Look at this one from February. Nessa's talking about our usual place, like they'd already established a routine. Jules' hands were shaking as he read. Elara knew all of this? More than knew. She was actively helping. I showed him a series of messages where Elara had provided alibis, covered for Nessa's absences, and even helped coordinate meeting times when Mason's wife would be out of town. She told me she was going to book clubs, Jules said quietly. All those Thursday nights when she said she was discussing literature with Nessa and some other women, they were, what? Planning affairs? Planning, covering up, probably laughing about how clueless we were. I leaned back in my chair. The question is, what do we do about it? Jules was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder than I'd ever heard it. Elara called me this morning, he said. She wants to recant everything she said last night, claims she was drunk and jealous and making things up to hurt Nessa. And I told her I needed time to think. He looked at me directly. But after seeing this, I don't need time. I need a lawyer. We spent the next hour going through the evidence systematically. Jules had his own revelations to share. Unexplained expenses on their joint credit card, mysterious phone calls that Elara would take in another room, weekend trips that now seemed suspiciously timed with Nessa's work conferences. "She's been gaslighting me for months," he said, the anger finally breaking through his shock. "Every time I questioned something that didn't make sense, she made me feel like I was being paranoid or controlling." They had a system, I agreed. Mutual alibis, coordinated stories, shared lies. This wasn't just an affair, it was a conspiracy. As we talked, my phone kept buzzing with notifications. The barbecue video had spread far beyond our immediate social circle. Friends of friends were sharing it, adding their own commentary, turning our neighborhood drama into viral entertainment. "Have you seen the comments?" Jules asked, showing me his phone screen. I scrolled through the responses to the video. Most were expressions of shock and sympathy, but a few revealed that Nessa and Mason's affair hadn't been as secret as they'd thought. Several people mentioned seeing them together at restaurants or hotels, assuming they were just friends catching up. One comment particularly caught my attention. "I saw them at the Bellingham Boutique Hotel last weekend. Thought it was weird that Nessa was there when she told everyone she was at a spa retreat." "They were getting sloppy," I observed. "Or maybe they just stopped caring about getting caught?" Jules finished reading and put his phone down with a disgusted expression. Elara's been commenting too, trying to do damage control, claiming everything was taken out of context. Too late for that. I showed him my tablet screen, where I'd been monitoring the social media fallout in real time. The video's been shared 47 times in the last 12 hours. Screenshots of the text messages are starting to circulate. This isn't going away. We agreed to coordinate our responses. Jules would handle Elara's attempts to recant her confession, while I dealt with Nessa's damage control efforts. We exchanged contact information and promised to keep each other informed of any new developments. As I was leaving the coffee shop, my phone rang. Nessa's mother. "Rhett, dear," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Could you and Vanessa come to our hotel this afternoon? Her father and I would like to discuss what happened last night." "Of course," I replied. "Would 2 o'clock work?" "That would be perfect. And Rhett, please bring any documentation you might have regarding the allegations." I smiled grimly. Nessa's parents had always prided themselves on being reasonable, practical people. They would want facts, evidence, proof before making any judgments about their daughter's behavior. I was more than happy to provide all three. When I got home, I found Nessa pacing the living room with her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone, probably Elara or Mason, trying to coordinate their response to the crisis. She ended the call when she saw me and immediately went on the offensive. "You can't show my parents that folder," she said. "It's private information obtained without my consent." "It's financial records from our joint accounts and messages backed up to our shared cloud storage," I replied calmly. "Nothing private about it." "I'll call a lawyer." "Good idea. You're going to need one." I headed toward the stairs. "We're meeting your parents at 2. I assume you'll want to shower and change first." She followed me upstairs, her voice rising with desperation. "Rhett, please, can't we handle this privately? Do we really need to involve everyone?" I stopped at the bedroom doorway and turned to face her. "You involved everyone the moment you started lying to them. All those people who covered for you, who believed your stories about work trips and girls' weekends. Your parents, who've been asking why we seem distant lately. Our friends, who've been watching our marriage fall apart without understanding why. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did go this far, and now everyone gets to know the truth." I spent the next hour preparing for the meeting with Nessa's parents. I printed additional copies of the most damaging evidence, organized everything chronologically, and prepared a simple, factual summary of what I'd discovered. Nessa, meanwhile, was making frantic phone calls. I could hear her through the bathroom door, alternately pleading with someone and angrily demanding that they fix this situation. At 1:30, she emerged from the bathroom looking composed and determined. She'd put on a conservative dress and minimal makeup, clearly aiming for an appearance of wounded innocence. "I'm not going," she announced. "Your choice," I replied, pocketing the folder of evidence. "I'll give your parents your regards. You can't tell them without me there to defend myself. Watch me." She grabbed my arm as I headed for the door. "Rhett, please, think about what you're doing. Once you show them that information, there's no taking it back. Our marriage will be over." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up at her face. "Nessa, our marriage was over the moment you decided Mason was more important than our vows. I'm just making sure everyone understands that." I gently removed her hand and walked out of the house, leaving her standing in the hallway with tears streaming down her face. Whether those tears were from genuine remorse or frustration at losing control of the situation, I no longer cared enough to determine. The drive to her parents' hotel gave me time to think about what I was about to do. Nessa's parents had always treated me like a son, welcoming me into their family with warmth and genuine affection. They'd been married for 43 years, weathering the normal ups and downs of a long relationship with grace and mutual respect. They deserved to know that their daughter had been systematically lying to everyone who loved her. The hotel lobby was elegant but understated, the kind of place that catered to business travelers and affluent retirees. I found Nessa's parents in the restaurant, sitting at a corner table with coffee and serious expressions. "Where's Vanessa?" her mother asked as I sat down. "She decided not to come," I replied. "I think she's having trouble facing the reality of the situation." Her father leaned forward, his banker's instincts taking over. "Show us what you found." For the next 30 minutes, I walked them through the evidence methodically and without editorial comment. I let the hotel receipts, text messages, and financial records speak for themselves. Nessa's parents listened in increasingly stunned silence as the scope of their daughter's deception became clear. When I finished, her mother was crying quietly. Her father sat back in his chair, looking older than he had when I'd arrived. 6 months, he said finally. "She's been lying to us for 6 months. "Probably longer," I replied. This is just what I could document electronically. "The money," her mother whispered. "She's been using your joint account to pay for this?" $8,000 over 6 months. Hotels, restaurants, shopping trips, travel expenses. I showed them the credit card statements. All charged to accounts that I contribute to as well. Nessa's father studied the financial records with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating loan applications and investment portfolios. "This isn't just an affair," he said quietly. "This is financial fraud." That's how I see it, too. Her mother looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to protect myself legally and financially," I replied. "Beyond that, I honestly don't know yet." We talked for another hour about practical matters. Lawyers, financial arrangements, the logistics of separation. Nessa's parents were devastated but practical, offering their support while making it clear that they couldn't condone their daughter's behavior. As I was leaving, her father pulled me aside. "Rhett," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens between you and Vanessa, you'll always be family to us. What she's done, it's not the daughter we raised." I drove home feeling emotionally drained but strategically satisfied. Nessa's parents now had the full truth, which meant her support system was crumbling. Jules was dealing with Elara's lies, which meant their mutual alibi network was falling apart. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw a familiar car parked on the street. Mason's silver BMW, gleaming in the afternoon sun like a challenge. Through the living room window, I could see 2 figures in animated conversation, Nessa and Mason probably planning their next move in what they still thought was a game they could win. I sat in my truck for a moment, considering my options. I could go inside and confront them directly, but that would likely devolve into shouting and accusations. I could wait for Mason to leave and deal with Nessa alone, but that felt passive. Or I could do something that would send a very clear message about who was really in control of this situation. I pulled out my phone and started recording as I walked toward the house. Time to let Mason know that his affair had consequences beyond just broken marriages. Mason Kittredge had always been the kind of man who expected the world to arrange itself around his convenience. Tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions, he represented everything I'd learned to distrust about certain types of successful men. When I walked into my own living room and found him sitting on my couch, drinking from one of my coffee mugs, that distrust crystallized into something much colder. "Rhett," he said, standing up with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to smoothing over awkward situations. "Good to see you. Nessa and I were just talking about last night." "In my house," I observed, not moving from the doorway. "Drinking my coffee?" "I brought coffee," Nessa interjected quickly. Mason stopped by to apologize for the misunderstanding. "Misunderstanding?" I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen where I had the folder of evidence open. Which part was misunderstood? The hotel receipts or the text messages? Mason's confident expression faltered slightly as he recognized what he was looking at. "Look, Rhett, I think we can handle this like adults. What happened between Nessa and me, it's complicated. Actually, it's pretty simple. You're both married to other people, and you've been having an affair for months." I stepped into the room, noting how Mason unconsciously moved closer to Nessa. "The complicated part is figuring out how to explain it to your wife." "Claire doesn't need to know about this," Mason said quickly. "It would just hurt her unnecessarily." "Interesting perspective. So you're concerned about protecting Claire from unnecessary hurt. But you weren't concerned about that when you were taking Nessa to hotels 6 blocks from where Claire lives. Nessa shot me a warning look. Rhett, we're trying to have a civilized conversation here. No, you're trying to manage the fallout from getting caught. There's a difference. I sat down in the armchair across from them, deliberately casual. But I'm curious about something, Mason. How long have you two been planning this? Planning what? This affair. Was it something that just happened, or did you seek each other out specifically? Mason and Nessa exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. This hadn't been a spontaneous rekindling of old feelings. It had been deliberate, calculated, planned. We reconnected at the neighborhood holiday party, Nessa said carefully. We were just catching up about old times. And that catching up led to 6 months of hotel meetings and $8,000 in expenses. I pulled up the timeline on my phone. Pretty expensive conversation. Mason was getting uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. Look, Rhett, I understand you're upset, but dragging this out in public isn't going to help anyone. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Well, he glanced at Nessa, who nodded encouragingly. Nessa and I have been talking about making this official, ending our current marriages and starting fresh together. I stared at them for a moment, processing the audacity of what I'd just heard. They'd come to my house, sat on my furniture, and calmly informed me that they wanted to end my marriage so they could legitimize their affair. You want me to just step aside? Make it easy for you? It would be better for everyone, Nessa said. Clean breaks, minimal drama, no need to involve lawyers or drag this through the courts. And what about Claire? Is she on board with this arrangement? Mason shifted uncomfortably. Claire and I will work that out privately. Will you? Because from what I understand, Claire has no idea any of this is happening. She thinks you're happily married. That's between Claire and me. I leaned back in my chair, studying both of them. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want me to quietly divorce Nessa, you'll eventually tell Claire about the affair and ask for a divorce, and then you two can ride off into the sunset together? Essentially, yes, Mason said, his confidence returning. It's the most mature way to handle the situation. Mature. I repeated the word like I was tasting something unpleasant. You think having a 6-month affair and then demanding that your spouses step aside gracefully is mature? We're trying to minimize the damage, Nessa said, for everyone involved. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Mason's BMW parked in front of my house. The car was pristine, detailed to showroom perfection, the kind of vehicle that made a statement about its owner's success and status. That's a beautiful car, I said conversationally. Mason looked confused by the change of subject. Thank you, it's the new M5. Just got it last month. Must have cost a fortune. Well, when you work hard, you deserve to enjoy the rewards. I turned back to face them. The thing about expensive cars is that they require a lot of maintenance. Very delicate, high-performance vehicles. One small problem can cause thousands of dollars in damage. What's your point? Mason asked, though something in his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. My point is that actions have consequences. You can't just take what you want and expect everyone else to clean up the mess. I pulled up a contact on my phone. For instance, Claire should probably know what her husband has been doing with our joint bank accounts. You can't call Claire, Mason said, standing up quickly. Why not? You said she'd find out eventually anyway. I'm just accelerating the timeline. Rhett, please, Nessa said, but I was already dialing. The phone rang twice before a cheerful voice answered. Hello? Hi, Claire. This is Rhett Vossen, Nessa's husband. I was wondering if you and Mason might be free for dinner tonight. There's something I'd like to discuss with both of you. I could hear the confusion in Claire's voice. Oh, hi, Rhett. That's so sweet of you to call. Let me check with Mason. There was a pause. Actually, he's not here right now. He said he had a business meeting this afternoon. A business meeting, I repeated, looking directly at Mason, who had gone pale. Well, when he gets back from his meeting, could you ask him to call me? It's about some financial irregularities I've discovered that might affect both our families. Financial irregularities? That sounds serious. It is serious, but I'd prefer to discuss it with both of you together. After I hung up, the living room was silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Mason was staring at me with a mixture of anger and panic. You have no right to involve Claire in this, he said. I have every right to inform someone that her husband is using joint accounts to fund an affair, just like she has a right to know where her money is going. It's not her money. I earned that money. Actually, in a community property state like Washington, it's both of your money, just like the money you and Nessa have been spending was both mine and hers. I sat back down, enjoying their obvious discomfort. But don't worry, I'm sure Claire will be very understanding when you explain how mature and civilized this whole arrangement is. Nessa was texting furiously on her phone, probably trying to coordinate damage control with Elara or warn Mason's wife before I could reach her, but it was too late for that kind of maneuvering. "You're making a mistake," Mason said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I have resources, connections. I can make this very difficult for you." "Are you threatening me? In my own house?" "I'm explaining reality. You're a furniture maker in a small town. I manage portfolios worth millions of dollars. If you want to play hardball, you're going to lose." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Could you repeat that? I want to make sure I have your exact words when I file the police report." Mason realized what I was doing and immediately backed down. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just suggesting that cooperation would be better for everyone." Cooperation. I stopped recording but kept the phone visible. Like the cooperation Nessa showed when she was charging your affair to our joint accounts, or the cooperation Elara showed when she was helping you two cover your tracks. "This is getting us nowhere," Nessa said, standing up. "Mason, maybe you should go." "Good idea," I agreed. "But Mason, before you leave, you should probably move your car." "Why?" "Because I'm about to call Claire back and give her this address so she can see for herself where her husband spends his business meetings." Mason was out the door so fast he left his coffee mug on the table. Through the window, I watched him practically sprint to his BMW and speed away, tires squealing on the asphalt. Nessa stood in the middle of the living room, looking lost and angry. "You're destroying everything," she said. "No," I replied calmly. "You destroyed everything. I'm just making sure everyone knows what you destroyed." My phone buzzed with a text message from Jules. "Elara's trying to get a lawyer to stop us from sharing the evidence. Thought you should know." I showed the message to Nessa. "Looks like your friend is getting desperate." "We're all getting desperate," she said quietly. "This has gone too far. It went too far the moment you decided to cheat on me. Everything since then has just been consequences." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage the situation. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "Fine," she said. "If that's how you want to play this, I can play too. I'm calling my lawyer. By tomorrow, you'll be served with papers." "What kind of papers?" "Restraining order, harassment charges, whatever it takes to stop you from destroying my life." AI laughed, which seemed to surprise her. "Nessa, you destroyed your own life. I'm just documenting it." After she stormed upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, thinking about what had just happened. Mason's threats didn't worry me. Men like him were used to intimidating people through wealth and connections, but they folded quickly when faced with actual consequences. Nessa's legal threats were more concerning, but I had evidence on my side. My phone rang again. Claire. "Rhett, I just had the strangest thing happen. Mason came home in a panic, saying there's been some kind of misunderstanding and that I shouldn't talk to you or Nessa about anything." "That is strange," I said carefully. "He's acting very nervous, which isn't like him at all, and when I asked him about the business meeting you mentioned, he got angry and said it was confidential." She paused. "Rhett, is everything okay? You sounded worried when you called earlier." I looked up at the ceiling, where I could hear Nessa pacing and talking on the phone. Tomorrow she'd probably have a lawyer. Mason would likely try to use his connections to pressure me into silence. They'd coordinate their stories, present a united front, and try to paint me as the unreasonable party in this situation. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed I would be passive, that I'd accept their betrayal quietly and let them control the narrative. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Claire," I said, "would you be free for coffee tomorrow morning? There are some things about our spouses that I think you should know." The next morning brought legal papers, just as Nessa had promised. A process server appeared at my door at 8 a.m. with a temporary restraining order and a harassment complaint. According to the documents, I was systematically stalking and intimidating my wife and her friends, using illegally obtained private communications to damage their reputations and relationships. I read through the papers while drinking my coffee, admiring the creative legal language that transformed showing people evidence of an affair into criminal harassment. Nessa's lawyer had done a thorough job of painting me as an unhinged husband who was lashing out irrationally at innocent parties. The restraining order required me to stay at least 100 yards away from Nessa, Elara, and Mason. It also prohibited me from distributing, sharing, or publicizing any private communications or personal information related to any of the three parties. In other words, they were trying to legally silence me. I called my own lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Hendricks who specialized in family law and had a reputation for not backing down from fights. She agreed to see me immediately. "This is interesting," Patricia said after reviewing the documents, "that they're trying to use harassment law to prevent you from using evidence in a divorce proceeding. Can they do that? They can try. But harassment requires a pattern of behavior intended to intimidate or threaten. Sharing evidence of adultery with affected parties isn't harassment, it's disclosure of relevant information." She leaned back in her chair. "The question is, how far do you want to push this?" "All the way," I said without hesitation. "Good, because I have just made a tactical error. By filing this restraining order, they've created a legal proceeding where all of your evidence becomes discoverable. They're essentially forcing a court to examine the very information they're trying to suppress." Patricia filed a motion to dismiss the harassment charges and a counter-motion to dissolve the restraining order based on the evidence I'd gathered. She also filed preliminary divorce papers on my behalf, citing adultery and financial misconduct as grounds for dissolution of marriage. "This is going to get messy," she warned. "Are you prepared for that?" "It's already messy. I'm just making sure everyone sees how messy it really is." While Patricia handled the legal maneuvering, I focused on the social aspects of my campaign. The restraining order meant I couldn't contact Nessa, Elara, or Mason directly, but it didn't prevent me from sharing information with other affected parties. I met Claire at a quiet cafe across town, bringing a carefully organized folder of evidence. She arrived looking confused and worried, clearly struggling to understand why her husband had forbidden her from speaking to me. "Mason says you're having some kind of breakdown," she said as we sat down. "He claims you're making up stories to hurt him because you're jealous of his success." "That's one interpretation," I replied, sliding the folder across the table. "Here's another one." For the next hour, I walked Claire through the same evidence I'd shown Nessa's parents. Hotel receipts, text messages, financial records, timeline documentation. Claire's face went through a progression of emotions, confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a cold, calculating fury that reminded me why she'd been so successful in her charity work. She was a woman who got things done. 6 months, she said quietly, staring at a text message where Mason discussed meeting Nessa at their usual place. "At least 6 months that I can document. Possibly longer." She flipped through the financial records, her background in nonprofit accounting making her particularly interested in the money trail. "He's been spending our joint funds on this? $8,000 that I can trace. Probably more if you look at your own accounts." Claire was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," I said, genuinely surprised by the question. "I just thought you deserved to know the truth." "But you're fighting this legally, right? The divorce, the financial issues?" "Yes." "Then you need an ally who understands Mason's financial situation." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the documents. "I handle all of our charitable giving, which means I have access to every account, every investment, every asset we own. If Mason thinks he can hide money or manipulate the divorce proceedings, he's about to learn otherwise." I hadn't expected Claire to become an active participant in exposing the affair, but her offer made strategic sense. Mason's wealth and connections were his primary weapons in this conflict. Having his own wife turn those resources against him would neutralize his advantages. "Are you sure you want to get involved in this?" I asked. "It's going to be ugly." "Rhett, my husband has been lying to me for months, stealing from our joint accounts and making me look like a fool in front of our entire social circle. It's already ugly." She closed the folder and met my eyes. "The only question is whether he's going to face consequences for his actions." We spent another hour coordinating our approach. Claire would secure copies of their financial records and document any suspicious expenses that might be related to the affair. I would continue building the timeline of events and gathering evidence of the deception. We agreed to share information through our respective lawyers to avoid any appearance of collusion. As I was leaving the cafe, my phone buzzed with a text from Jules. "Emergency. Can you meet me at my office? Elara's lawyer is threatening to sue both of us for defamation." Jules worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. When I arrived at his office, I found him pacing behind his desk with a legal document in his hand and a grim expression on his face. "They're claiming we've engaged in a conspiracy to damage Elara's reputation and business," he said, handing me the letter. "They want us to sign a statement saying we fabricated the evidence and that Elara never admitted to helping cover up an affair." I read through the legal threat, noting the same creative interpretation of events that had characterized Nessa's restraining order. According to Elara's lawyer, the barbecue confession had been taken out of context, the evidence was fabricated, and Jules and I were engaged in a malicious campaign to destroy an innocent woman's career. "What did you tell them?" I told them to go to hell, Jules said with satisfaction. Then I called my own lawyer. Good. What did your lawyer say? That defamation requires false statements, and everything we've shared is documented fact. They're bluffing, hoping we'll back down rather than face a legal fight. We compared notes on the various legal threats we'd received. The pattern was clear. Nessa, Mason, and Elara were using intimidation tactics to try to silence us before the full scope of their deception became public knowledge. They're scared, I observed. If they thought they could win this fight, they wouldn't be trying so hard to prevent it from happening. My thoughts exactly, but Jules had additional information that added a new dimension to the situation. I've been going through Elara's financial records, he said. She's been spending money she doesn't have, credit cards maxed out, personal loans, even borrowing against her real estate commissions. Gambling? I don't think so. The expenses are all lifestyle related. Expensive clothes, spa treatments, luxury travel. She's been living like she makes twice what she actually earns. I thought about the implications. Maybe she's been getting financial help from someone. That's what I'm thinking. And given what we know about her involvement in covering up the affair. You think Mason's been paying her for her help? It would make sense. Elara provides alibis and cover stories. Mason provides financial support for her lifestyle. Everyone wins except the people being lied to. If Jules was right, then the affair was even more calculated than I'd realized. It wasn't just two people rekindling an old romance. It was a coordinated deception involving financial incentives and systematic manipulation of their social circle. Can you prove it? I'm working on it. Bank records, credit card statements, unexplained deposits. If Mason's been supporting Elara financially, there will be a paper trail. We agreed to coordinate our legal responses and continue sharing information. The restraining orders and legal threats were meant to isolate us, but they were actually having the opposite effect, forcing us to work together more closely and systematically. As I drove home, I reflected on how much the situation had escalated in just 48 hours. What had started as a drunken confession at a barbecue had evolved into a complex legal and social battle involving multiple marriages, financial fraud, and coordinated deception. But the most interesting development was how the people who'd been betrayed were starting to work together. Claire's financial expertise, Jules's accounting skills, and my own methodical approach to gathering evidence were creating a formidable opposition to the affair participants' attempts at damage control. When I got home, I found a note from Nessa saying she'd moved out temporarily to let things cool down. The house felt different without her presence, quieter but also cleaner somehow, as if removing the source of deception had cleared the air. I spent the evening organizing my evidence files and preparing for what I knew would be an extended legal battle. Nessa, Mason, and Elara thought they could use intimidation and legal maneuvering to escape the consequences of their actions. They were about to discover that some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost. My phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. Patricia, my lawyer. I have good news and bad news, she said. The good news is that the judge threw out the harassment charges. The bad news is that they've escalated to criminal court. Criminal court? Mason filed a police report claiming you threatened him physically and vandalized his property. They're pushing for assault and destruction of property charges. I sat down heavily, processing this new development. I never touched Mason or his property. I believe you, but they're playing hardball now, trying to get you arrested before the divorce proceedings can move forward. Patricia paused. Rhett, I need to ask you directly. Have you done anything that could be construed as threatening or destructive? No, I've been careful to stay within legal boundaries. Good, because tomorrow we're going to court, and we need to be prepared for anything they might throw at us. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Nessa, Mason, and Elara had made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that escalating the legal pressure would force me to back down and accept their version of events. Instead, they just guaranteed that everything would be examined in open court, under oath, with full discovery of all evidence. They wanted a war. Tomorrow, they were going to get one. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived for the hearing. Somehow word had leaked about the criminal charges, and the local media had picked up the story of the barbecue betrayal, as they were calling it. The combination of adultery, financial fraud, and neighborhood drama had created the kind of story that sold papers and generated clicks. Patricia met me at the courthouse entrance, looking grimly satisfied. The media attention is actually working in our favor, she said. Mason's lawyer is going to have a hard time painting you as a dangerous criminal when the whole city knows the real story. Inside the courtroom, I saw the opposing legal team for the first time. Mason had hired a prestigious firm known for representing wealthy defendants in high-profile cases. Nessa's lawyer was there too, along with Elara's attorney. They'd clearly coordinated their strategy, presenting a united front against what they were characterizing as my campaign of harassment and intimidation. But when I looked around the courtroom, I realized they'd made another tactical error. Claire was sitting in the gallery, having taken time off from her charity work to attend the hearing. Jules was there, too, along with several neighbors who'd witnessed the original barbecue confession. Nessa's parents sat in the back row, looking uncomfortable but determined. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from either side. She reviewed the charges quickly, then looked up with an expression that suggested she was already skeptical. "Mr. Kittredge," she said, addressing Mason's lawyer, "your client claims that Mr. Vossen threatened him physically and vandalized his property. What evidence do you have to support these charges?" Mason's lawyer stood up confidently. "Your Honor, Mr. Vossen has been engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment against my client and his associates. He's distributed private communications without consent, made threatening phone calls, and created a hostile environment that has forced my client to fear for his safety." "Threatening phone calls?" the judge asked. "Do you have recordings of these calls?" "Well, no, Your Honor, but what about the alleged vandalism? Do you have photos, repair estimates, witness statements?" Mason's lawyer shuffled through his papers. "The vandalism was psychological rather than physical. Mr. Vossen's actions have created emotional distress and reputational damage that—" "Counselor," the judge interrupted, "psychological vandalism is not a criminal offense. Do you have evidence of actual threats or actual property damage?" It became clear very quickly that the criminal charges were built on nothing but speculation and hurt feelings. Mason's team had assumed that filing charges would be enough to get me arrested and discredited, but they hadn't bothered to build an actual case. Patricia stood up when it was our turn to respond. "Your Honor, my client has been the victim of a coordinated fraud perpetrated by his wife, her lover, and their accomplices. Rather than face the consequences of their actions, they've chosen to use the legal system to silence the person who exposed their deception." She presented our evidence methodically: the hotel receipts, the text messages, the financial records that showed systematic misuse of joint accounts. She also presented new evidence that Claire had provided: bank records showing that Mason had been making regular cash payments to Elara, apparently in exchange for her help in covering up the affair. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, "Mr. Kittredge and Mrs. Vossen have been engaged in a 6-month affair funded by money stolen from joint marital accounts. When my client discovered this fraud and shared the evidence with affected parties, they responded by filing false charges in an attempt to criminalize his legitimate efforts to protect his financial interests. The judge reviewed our evidence carefully, taking particular interest in the financial records. Mrs. Hendricks, are you alleging that Mr. Kittredge paid Mrs. Trenix to help conceal his affair?" "That's exactly what we're alleging, Your Honor. We have bank records showing regular payments from Mr. Kittredge to Mrs. Trenix, corresponding with dates when Mrs. Trenix provided false alibis for Mrs. Vossen's whereabouts." Mason's lawyer objected. "Those payments could be for any number of legitimate business purposes." "What business?" the judge asked. "What services was Mrs. Trenix providing to Mr. Kittredge that would justify regular cash payments?" The lawyer couldn't answer, because there was no legitimate business relationship between Mason and Elara. The payments were clearly connected to her role in facilitating the affair. The judge called a recess to review all the evidence. When court resumed an hour later, her decision was swift and decisive. "The criminal charges against Mr. Vossen are dismissed," she announced. "There is no evidence of threats or property damage. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that Mr. Vossen was the victim of fraud, not the perpetrator of harassment." She turned to Mason's lawyer with obvious displeasure. "Counselor, your client appears to have used the criminal justice system in an attempt to silence someone who discovered his extramarital affair. If you file frivolous charges in my courtroom again, I'll hold you in contempt." But the judge wasn't finished. "However, the evidence presented today raises serious questions about potential fraud and conspiracy. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible criminal charges against Mr. Kittredge, Mrs. Vossen, and Mrs. Trenix." The courtroom erupted. Mason's team had come to court expecting to have me arrested, and instead they'd triggered a criminal investigation into their own client's behavior. As we left the courthouse, Patricia was practically grinning. "That went better than I'd hoped," she said. "Not only did we get the charges dismissed, but we've now got the DA looking into criminal fraud charges against them." The media was waiting outside, and I found myself surrounded by reporters asking for comments about the case. I kept my statements brief and factual, letting the court record speak for itself. But the real satisfaction came from watching Mason, Nessa, and Elara emerge from the courthouse looking shell-shocked. They'd expected to walk out victorious, having silenced their opposition through legal intimidation. Instead, They were facing potential criminal charges and a media circus that was broadcasting their private business to the entire city. Claire approached me as the crowd was dispersing. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me the truth." "What are you going to do now?" "I filed for divorce this morning," she replied, "and I've frozen all of our joint accounts pending a full financial audit. If Mason wants to fight this, he's going to do it without access to the money he's been stealing from our marriage." Jules joined us, looking relieved but determined. "Elara's real estate license is under review by the state board," he said. "Turns out using your professional relationships to facilitate fraud is grounds for license revocation." As I drove home, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed itself. 48 hours ago, Nessa, Mason, and Elara had been confident they could control the narrative and escape consequences for their actions. They'd assumed that legal intimidation would silence their opposition and allow them to continue their affair without interference. Instead, their aggressive tactics had backfired spectacularly. They were now facing criminal investigation, professional sanctions, and public humiliation. Their attempt to silence me had only amplified the story, turning a neighborhood scandal into citywide news. But I knew this wasn't over. People like Mason didn't give up easily, and Nessa had always been resourceful when cornered. They'd regroup, develop new strategies, and continue fighting to minimize the damage to their reputations and finances. The difference was that now they were fighting from a position of weakness, while I had allies, evidence, and the legal system on my side. When I got home, I found a message from Patricia on my answering machine. "Rhett, call me as soon as you get this. We've received a settlement offer from Nessa's lawyer. You're going to want to hear this." I called her back immediately. "What kind of settlement offer?" "They're offering to give you the house, half of all joint assets, and a lump sum payment of $50,000 if you agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement about the affair." "They want to buy my silence." "Essentially, yes. They're also offering to have Mason pay for any legal expenses you've incurred." I thought about the offer for a moment. It was actually quite generous from a financial standpoint, more than I would likely get in a contested divorce. But accepting it would mean agreeing never to discuss what had happened, allowing them to escape public accountability for their actions. "What do you think?" I asked Patricia. "Financially, it's a good deal, but I suspect you're not primarily motivated by financial considerations at this point." She was right. This had stopped being about money when Mason sat in my living room and demanded that I step aside to make his affair more convenient. It had become about accountability, consequences, and ensuring that their actions had lasting repercussions. "Reject the offer," I said. "We're going to trial." "Are you sure? A trial means everything becomes public record. Every detail of the affair, every financial transaction, every lie they told. It's going to be brutal for everyone involved." "Good," I replied. "Maybe next time they'll think twice before deciding that other people's lives are disposable." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Nessa, Mason, and Elara had just made their final mistake. By offering to pay me to keep quiet, they'd confirmed that they understood exactly how damaging the truth was to their reputations and futures. But they'd misunderstood my motivations completely. This was never about money or even personal revenge. It was about ensuring that actions have consequences, that lies get exposed, and that people who manipulate and betray others face the full weight of their choices. Tomorrow, Patricia would reject their settlement offer, and we'd prepare for trial. The real battle was just beginning, but I was confident about the outcome. After all, I had something they didn't, the truth. And in the end, the truth always wins.